Well, it certainly seems like summer has arrived here in the good old UK. It's a really, really warm day today, and if I start looking like I'm melting, please accept my apologies. The moment the sweat is running down my brow and it's actually dripping into my eyes, but I'm sure I will be okay. It's so unusual for here anyway. It's not normally what happens, but one of those things. Right, as you may have guessed, this is the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, and this is the edition for June of 2018. My guest today is somebody I've actually known at a distance, as it were, for quite a few years. I've followed her work with great interest and followed her articles with great interest. And I was trying to remember earlier on how we first made contact, and I suspect it was probably Emma's article many years ago in Fortean Times. Now, I have a collection of Fortean Times going back 1,000,001 years, and I keep all of them. So I was desperately trying to find the articles that Emma had actually written in the past, and I found the two of them. So I was delighted to actually being able to pre-read those before we started again to remind myself of them. Now, Emma is a self-employed freelance communications. She's a self-employed and works for the communications officer in the Northern Ireland Rare Disease Partnership. And she's also a freelance journalist, has written a series of quite fascinating articles. And because of her own personal experiences, there's a great deal of synergy between what I write and what Emma writes. But the difference is that the reasons for Emma's writing is very much to do with her own experiences, whereas I've never had extraordinary experiences except for occasionally migraine and deja vu brought about by migraines. But Emma actually's writing comes in many ways, both from her academic background, but also from her own experiences. And this is particularly fascinating. And in fact, as the leading question then, well, the first thing, Emma, how is it over there in Bangor, County Down? Is it nice?
It's gorgeous, actually. It's very un-Irish weather. It's baking hot. It's absolutely beautiful, stunning weather. I've had the boys in the sandpit, my son's in the sandpit, and it is beautiful weather. I live by the sea as well, so it's absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, really nice.
So, and we have
my great-grandfather came from Antrim. He was a McGee of the Island McGee fame as well, so you know they named it after him. No, they didn't, of course, but yeah. But I've only been to Belfast once, and I absolutely loved it as a city. You know, which is really great. It was almost like coming home. It was really good. Right, okay. So quickly moving on, I'm just really fascinated. I mean, how did you become interested yourself in Fortean phenomena? What was it that stimulated your interest then?
Well, I think I was always the kid who was interested in the quirky and interesting stuff. I was the child who was reading the Usborne books of the ghosts and the ghoulies and the monsters. And I was also very lucky in that my family were very much into that stuff. My grandfather was Loch Ness Investigation Bureau, and so we had Loch Ness books and ghost books and all that stuff. And I was always reading my brother's Arthur C. Clarke books and watching, when I probably shouldn't have been and was far too young, reading the Arthur C. Clarke books of mysteries and cryptozoology books. And then I was lucky enough in that I read those and I thought, actually, these are all quite interesting stuff. And then I read them and I thought, actually, this is quite interesting. And there's actually real stuff that you can then go on and do. So I read Human Sciences at Oxford for my degree. And so I started doing intelligent things, and I not just the wacky side of it. And so I kept going on the things, but always keeping the extraordinary side of it. So kept going on the sort of, let's say, the quirky and interesting side, because my feeling has always been that what's interesting, the strange and the unusual, always gives us the insight into reality and what's really going on. You don't have to necessarily believe what's happening, but whatever the unusual is a wonderful clue. And there's a lovely example in genetics, for example, in that there's a disease called Angelman syndrome, where children, they call happy puppet syndrome, where children are extraordinarily just very happy. It's a genetic disorder, but you can have clues from the way that they're behaving that can give you clues into how people are behaving, insights into how their brains work, into how everybody's brain works. And I found that very intriguing in genetics when I was studying genetics, how you can apply that to everybody. And in fact, with Angelman syndrome, the interesting thing there is you've got elves, and they believe that some ideas about changelings actually came from Angelman syndrome, because completely normal children, you have a normal child who looks like an elf, actually they're very elfin features. So this idea that you could use something unusual, and from that unusual thing, that anomalous phenomena, you can learn something about the wider world. And I think that was where maybe what I have always been intrigued by, take the unusual thing and learn something more general. And also the idea that anomalous things tend to have a universality. So things that we tend to think of as being very, very unusual, like ghost experiences. Someone can say, I've had the most unusual experience. It's so unusual. No one's ever had my experience ever of this UFO. No one's ever had my experience of a UFO. It had this feature, this feature, this feature. No one else has ever had this experience. And then they don't know this, but thousands and millions of people all around the world have had exactly their experience. And what does that tell us then? If everyone's having this unique experience, why are unique experiences universal? And what can we learn about that? And in every field of study that's interesting to me, whether it's genetics or health or folklore or whatever experience. And so I think that's what, I think if I look at all my interests, whether it's rare diseases, which is I'm sick leave at the moment, whether it's rare diseases, which is my proper job, or whether it's all the areas of Forteana, which I've been interested in, I think that's probably a universal feature, would be that.
Because that's very intriguing. I've long been fascinated, as you know myself, in terms of extraordinary experiences and exactly what the background of extraordinary experiences are. And rather like yourself, my background, my stimulation, I've always been interested in the phenomena, but I chose to actually, when I went to university, I chose to specialize in the sociology of religion, sociology of language, and the sociology of belief. So it would always intrigued me as to why people believe certain things. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we've come from slightly different positions. You've come from a kind of scientific position, and you're interested in extraordinary experiences from the genetics and everything else. And I'm from the experiential. But effectively, the thing you just said then about this particular syndrome where children actually look like elves, and it can be related in some way to changelings, which is something that people have always discussed historically. It goes to show, doesn't it, these ideas, these legends, these social mores, these social norms that are universal are actually based upon something effectively physiological initially, and then psychological as the child starts to do different behaviors. So clearly, this is the way forward, I think, in terms of our areas of interest. So you graduated from Oxford, and what did you then do? Did you move into that kind of field, or where did you lead yourself? Where did it lead you from there?
Well, I initially went to, was originally going to do genetics. And then I was doing an internship and realized that there was a robotic arm next to me in the laboratory that was going to take over from my job. And I realized that wasn't a good way to go down genetics route. Also, labs were not my thing. And then I studied at the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, was going to do epidemiology. But then, unfortunately, I became very unwell and very sick with various immune disorders. And I have a connective tissue disorder, which I've been very unwell with on and off for years, in addition to epilepsy. So my health has caused problems. So although I've been able to write and work, I've had periods of very bad ill health. But so what I went into immediately was School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, was to go to epidemiology and medical demography and anthropology. So to continue down the route of mixing science and epidemiology and public health with a little bit of human science type thing, continue that. So that's always been, and then add writing into that, and then I went and did journalism on top of that. So that was the direction I took, and I think that's always then been the recurring theme, is to work with almost consistently a health element plus writing for my career.
So you mentioned there about your epilepsy. which, as I understand it, is focused on the temporal lobe.
Yeah.
So therefore, you experience temporal lobe epilepsy. When did you first? When did it start? And how does it manifest in you in terms of this? Because clearly there are direct links, aren't there, between extraordinary experiences and TLE? Because I've written about it a lot, and I know you've written about it in articles. So let's discuss this a little bit, because you are an experiencer as well.
Yes, well, strangely enough, I wasn't diagnosed until about 2010. That was 8 years ago. Although apparently I'm a classic case. I had my first seizure as a child, and I suspect what happened was they made a decision back in the 80s. It wasn't considered a very bad thing to label a child as being epileptic if you could avoid it. So I had a full tonic-clonic seizure, and they decided let's not, if we can get away with not saying she's epileptic, shall we just leave it and see how she goes? But then in my teenage years, what I now know is fairly classic. I went to a doctor, and they said, she thinks she's having seizures. And actually a psychiatrist said, I was sent to a psychiatrist with severe OCD and very bad anxiety. And the psychiatrist said, actually, I think she's got epilepsy. And they did all the screening tests, and said, actually, it's borderline. I don't think she has. But I continued with what I now know were partial seizures, all the symptoms. And I now know this is very common, of periods where I have seizures, periods where I have migraines instead. And according to my epilepsy specialist now, that again is very common. You either go through periods of migraine or epilepsy, and you can go through the periods where one's under control and the other is happening. And then about 8 years ago, I've got swine flu. That was it. I got swine flu and went through a terrible period of getting worse and worse and worse, and to the point where I was probably having multiple seizures a week. For me, what happens is I get a terrible, terrible feeling of fear, absolute uncontrollable fear. I don't know what's going on. My brain will go, I don't know what's going on. And then I will just fade out, spacey, and just, usually that's my usual, what happens to me. Eventually I was like, they thought I was having strokes, and they thought I was having many strokes, and they tested me for all these things, and they put me on blood thinners, and I still wasn't any better, and they did it. Eventually I was, actually one occasion I was looking up Lewis Carroll on Wikipedia out of interest, and I'm curious about temporal lobe epilepsy. I've read about it. The last thing I actually remember researching it was reading Communion when I was a teenager, and thinking about remembering that they thought he had it. So I was thinking about it, and I was reading the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy. I was going, this is sounding awfully familiar. It really is sounding very like me. And sure enough, the specialists at Queen Square, and they were like, yeah. And they did an EEG, and it was fairly conclusive. It was, right temporal lobe. And they can give you a particular type of medication that will dead stop it immediately. And if they can, that's a diagnostic medication. It's not what they keep you on permanently, but if it works, it'll stop it. And sure enough, it worked to treat. And I'm very much under control now. If I don't take my meds, I have problems. It's taken a long time to get it under control. And having babies doesn't help, and hormones and that sort of thing doesn't help. But it's under control. But I do find it fascinating, because for me, it's the uncertainty. I think it's a lot more complicated even than the neurologists necessarily themselves understand, because there is a very reductionist approach. And I think a lot of patients are perhaps, I know I am, I don't really want to say, my last seizure was a bit more that I got very worried about something, and I felt a bit strange, and I had a bit of even I'm a bit reluctant to say that a seizure was, that it smelt like my grandparents' house, because that does sound like a very strange seizure sensation. Because that's a very strange thing to say, or that, I felt anxious and then I smelt my grandparent. That's a very strange thing to say. So these things, and they do mix with what we think of as psychic experiences. And where do you draw the line, particularly if you're the sort of person who believes in psychic experiences? And I do, to an extent, believe in the stranger things that can happen. And where do you draw the line? Where do you say, you know, where do you say that that's true? And what's memory? Again, because memory is one of the things that temporal lobe at the time. Where do you say that's what's memory? If a memory can be a seizure, how do you know you're not just remembering something? If anxiety can be a seizure, the other thing is it's a very complicated disorder. And one of the issues for me is that I have a connective tissue disorder as well. One of the things that it's associated with is the autonomic nervous system. And I have an autonomic nervous disorder as well. And one of my doctors said, you know, you're standing in front of me, you have a problem with your vasovagal attack, and you have a seizure. We're not going to know which is happening. So you have your vasovagal system, and so which is which? But then they're connected anyway. So it all becomes so much more complicated. And once you throw in the psychic, in the sense, not just in the sense of psychic phenomena, but the psychic in the sense of to do with the brain element, then you're getting even more complicated. And also, to make it even more complicated for patients, issues of race, to go back to being epidemiology, you know, issues of race in patients, you know, the number of patients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia if they're African origins, because their definitions of what they will describe will be different, and what they say to a doctor will be different to what, if I go into a doctor and describe something, I'll be treated differently to what they will describe. So it becomes incredibly complicated. Yeah, it's fascinating in itself.
Well, that's it. I mean, one of the things that when I wrote my first book, it was very much temporal lobe epilepsy that really stimulated migraine, and temporal lobe epilepsy that stimulated my interest, because I'm a classical migrainer. And I get aura experiences, I get deja vu sensations, I get the, like you mentioned, you know, the kind of the very evoked memory kind of things that, you know, you get an olfactory response where you have a particular smell that takes you back to somewhere, and it's associative. And of course, it would be argued, wouldn't it, neurologically, that of course in terms of the fear feeling, it's because it sits above the amygdala, so therefore there's the fear response within the limbic system. Then we have the linkages with memory and the way in which memory processing takes place in that area. So there are all these kind of wonderful areas of mixing in that temporal lobe experiences seem to be opening the doors of perception, which is, of course, I have a whole chapter in my new book on this very theme. Now, one of the things that I was particularly interested in was when you mentioned about your own TLE, because one of the things I saw happen was somebody I know who has experienced very, very powerful temporal lobe seizures. And I actually witnessed with my own eyes and saw her actually have a precognitive event take place that I saw happen, where she said something and while she was in an absence, and then effectively what she just described actually happened in reality, as if her kind of ability to understand time and space had changed in some way. Now, one of the things that you very much write about, and particularly in your articles, and specifically your article in Fortean Times from many years ago, is the idea that there seems to be a direct relationship between TLA and anomalous experiences. So it's a double-ended question now. The first one is, have you had anomalous experiences that you could relate to your TLA? And then secondly, a little bit of an exposition of the overall hypothesis and theory of linking temporal lobe epilepsy with extraordinary experiences. So, you know, if you would like to discuss that, that would be really fascinating.
Well, I think I have to begin with like a caveat, which is that it can sound very reductionist, because it can sound like I'm saying, or that people who think this are saying, that temporal lobe epilepsy is some kind of uber explanation for anomalous experiences. That somehow you can say, you know, that ghost, that was a seizure, or, you know, that was caused by a seizure. And that isn't necessarily the case. But anomalous experiences, it seems, can sometimes be either triggered by seizures, or perhaps seizure states can make you more receptive to anomalous experiences, or perhaps they've got nothing to do with it. So that's sort of three situations that may occur. So the reason is that among the sort of things that are symptoms of temporal lobe seizures, but just the temporal lobe seizures, because it happens to be that that's the sort of things that happen within your temporal lobe. There are sort of things that happen in other parts of the brain that can also cause this, but it just happens that the temporal lobe is where a lot of this sort of stuff happens, but also it's also very common to have a seizure in that part of the brain. Is deja vu, as you've said, which people get all the time. It's very common, but there are different types and degrees of deja vu. As you can have this the kind of, oh, that's funny, or the kind of overwhelming, oh my goodness, I really have been here before, which is completely different. Full hallucinations of all sorts of types, hearing or sight or smell or any type, or even sense, like you feel stuff on your skin or whatever. Then distortions of what they can call Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where things are very small or very big. And again, that could tie in with some anomalous, what you're thinking when you're having a kind of paranormal experience. The ones that can be linked to sort of ghosty stuff, again, that can be linked into things, seeing lights, because that can be sort of aura type things. Feelings of great intensity and feeling great euphoria and excitement. To get things again, tying a bit more, getting a little bit more onto the kind of vaguer things, there's something called Geschwind syndrome, which is very, it's kind of what they thought I had when I was 16. It's kind of when you're a longer term thing where you're kind of having a lot of seizures over a longer period of time. It's what I think Joan of Arc had. It's where you have hyper-religiosity, hyper-morality, you're having a lot of seizures, your temporal lobe is very, very active. And you get into like a very hyper-moral state. And then you start thinking, oh my goodness, you're starting to have what they call the God connection in your brain, temporal lobe. And that's also coming into the idea where the temporal lobe, well, they've done some research where if you stimulate the temporal lobe, you might suddenly start having a connection with a higher being. And then that higher being or an entity, that's another idea where the seizure is coming in, and that connection is getting in there. Now, what that being connection, for some people that being is going to be God. For some people that being is going to be maybe a ghost. It might be an alien. And they've done that, the study was, the God helmet was one example. Some people think that's where alien abductions come in. That idea, you put it in, stimulate the temporal lobe. What are you going to see? If you stimulate someone's temporal lobe, what are they going to see? If you pick 5 people off the street and you stimulate their temporal lobe, what is each person going to see? Actually, that's quite a fascinating experiment, because everyone's idea is going to be different. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, and everybody has, the other thing is interesting is this theory called the threshold theory, which is that we all walk around every day at a different point of being theoretically able to have a seizure. Everybody all the time is possibly about to have a seizure, and we all, for different reasons, are different ways to have a seizure. Now, if you're lucky, you're way, way up here, and you're not likely to have a seizure ever. And you might go your whole life way, way up here, never having a seizure. And then once you've had a seizure, you go down here, because once you've had a seizure, you're more likely to have another seizure. And if you use certain drugs, you come down a little bit more. And if you have a head injury, you go down a little bit more. And if you're a child, you go down. And if you're a bit older person goes down here. And if you're stressed, you go down here. And if you are very tired, you go down here. And if you're epileptic and you don't get your drugs, you go down here. And all these different things factor in. Everybody is there along a scale all the time, going above, up and down. And the threshold for having a seizure dips along here. And at any time, anybody can go on a little meter. So you take anyone off the street and you kind of put them up and down that little thing. And I said, not wanting to be reductionist, but the theory is that you go stimulate anyone's temporal lobe, they might have a seizure at any time. And just over Christmas, this fascinates me because for all my anomalous experiences, and I've had lots of synchronicity and occasional weird stuff and childhood stuff, but this one just showed to me the idea of entities, and I'm fascinated by entities and jinn and all this stuff and genie and all that stuff. And then I was at Christmas, I'd had pneumonia, I had been taking antibiotics make your epilepsy drugs less effective. I'd had fevers, I was very tired, hadn't had much sleep. So you can see I was getting closer and closer to I already had epilepsy. I was getting closer and closer to the seizure threshold. For some reason, it just went too low below it. And I think I even missed a dose of medicine, so I went right down. And I was lying in bed, and I just turned to my husband and I said, really please don't laugh at me. And he said, I'm not going to laugh, whatever you said. I said, really, please don't laugh. And I said, well, he said, what? I said, I know there isn't, but I have a really, really strong feeling that there's a giant snake on the headboard. He said, what do you mean? I said, there's a giant snake on the headboard. I said, no, there isn't, but I feel like there's a giant black snake on the headboard. And he said, what do you mean? He said, I've got the feeling like I'm having a seizure, and I've got the feeling of a seizure, and I feel like there's a giant snake on the headboard. I can see it in my head. I'm not looking, I'm not going to look because it's a giant snake, but I can feel a giant snake on the headboard. And he said, well, there isn't. Trust me, there's no giant snake on the headboard. I said, yeah, I know there's not a giant snake on the headboard, but that's how I feel that there's a giant snake behind me. And he said, well, calm down, because I think you're having a seizure. I'm like, yeah, I think I'm having a seizure. I think you're right. I think I'm having a seizure. But for some reason, on that occasion, my brain, for the first time ever, went entity and went snake. And it was all powerful. It was snake. I wasn't actually looking at the headboard, snake. He said, well, just calm down, let it go. If it's a seizure, it'll ride out within 2-3 minutes. It'll go. You'll just be left with a headache. You'll feel terrible. You'll feel exhausted. You'll feel like you've had a headache. Sure enough, within 5 minutes, I'm just lying there like, why a snake? I don't like snakes. I really don't like snakes. My son had been watching a cartoon with snakes in it earlier in the day. I was exhausted. The only thing that was more interesting than all that, apart from it being fascinating that I'd had that experience, and as I said, I think anybody could have that experience in the right circumstances. The following day, I'm flicking through the newspaper, and there's a picture of a man who'd found a giant black snake in his car in Australia. It was the same type of snake, a bit smaller, but it was the same flipping snake as my dream. The only thing I think was that maybe it had been on my Facebook feed and I'd scrolled past it. But it shows, and to me, the really interesting thing is that my brain went to snake, and I know what was happening, or I had a guess of what was happening. Had I been hyper-religious, had my biggest fear been demons, I could have gone to demon. Would have been a very, very different conversation with my husband. There's a demon on the headboard is a very different conversation, a very different experience. And I think so it just shows that you can have this, and I think it could happen to anyone. It shows that it shows the pathway as to what can happen. But it's that something as pure as an experience of an hallucination of fear can be generated. But having said all that, I don't believe that excludes the possibility that these states are not also able to allow access to other things, if that makes sense.
Absolutely fascinating. There will be people who read my work who will be bouncing up and down at your description there and saying, wow, that is absolutely incredible. Believe me, folks, there was no Emma and I have not discussed this in advance. There was no way that Emma was, this is the first time we've ever been in communication in this way. And it's uncanny because, of course, as you know, I argue that people who experience temporal epilepsy and my doors of perception hypothesis, the doors are much wider open to perceiving other things. That during these circumstances, you have the sensed presence of something that is greater than you. As you said, if you were religious, as with Gershwin syndrome, that you would actually interpret it as being God or something greater than yourself. But I was particularly intrigued here with the symbolism of the snake, because you're probably not aware, but I've had one of my experiences I had with the lucid light device, the Lucia machine, that I've written about quite a few times in my books, stimulated after I had first used the machine. I had a series of very, very powerful dreams involving snakes. And it does seem that the symbolism of snakes, particularly in terms of people who take ayahuasca, people who take dimethyltryptamine and everything else, there does seem to be this kind of serpent thing going on. Now, we don't go into the crazy areas of David Icke and everything else, but there does seem to be some form of archetype here going on. And sometimes I've actually thought, is this somehow DNA? In terms of the symbolic, the Jungian symbolism of the Ouroboros and everything else, is it somehow a symbol of DNA in some way?
Well, they say it's because snakes go into the underworld and come back up, don't they?
Oh yes, of course. So the undulation, yeah, because
they can go down and up. They go into the ground and they come up. So they access the underworld and our world.
So it's very much a shamanic thing as well.
They make a noise. That's why I don't trust them. That's the problem.
The other thing that you mentioned there was even more intriguing was, and we will go off on a slight tangent here because I'm really keen to do this, but we will boomerang back, is that, of course, your description there of the extraordinary experience then effectively almost seemingly being backfed to you and your subconscious via a future event, you seeing the snake on TV or whatever, of course, comes back to somebody that we have links with, which is J.B. Priestley. And I was particularly fascinated by, you mentioned your grandfather, Norman Collins, and what he was interested in terms of that. But also, he knew Priestley, which I'd like to talk a little bit about. And also that you've got a link with J.J. Bennett as well, which is even more exciting. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, so my maternal grandfather was Norman Collins, who knew Jack Priestley through. He was must have been Jack at glance. So my Norman Collins was, though he was a writer, known as a writer later. He worked for Glance, the publisher, and he was also an agent as well before he was a writer. So that was how he knew Priestley. And they were friends. They were very in the SBR together, and they were both fascinated by all the paranormal stuff and as friends. And Priestley's house was haunted, and they used to go on holiday in the Isle of Wight, and it was all they were very into all that stuff together, and it was all a big fascination. And again, in one talk about synchronicity and all the fascination of all that. So the Priestleys and my grandparents were very good friends, and as a family, my mum would have spent time at their house. And although the Priestleys were older than my grandparents, so I gave your Priestley book to my mum for her birthday, and she read it and came back the next day, and she says, "I didn't know that Priestley knew Jack Bennett." So he was married to my dad's maternal aunt, who was his first wife. So again, we didn't know this, which again is strange, presumably because the Priestleys wouldn't have gone to the wedding because they were busy or something. A close connection. And then again, the synchronicity that day, having had this conversation through no random thing, Facebook then pings the connection that my cousins on that side then on that day decide to accept the Facebook request from 18 months ago.
Wow.
Facebook, basically a cousin tracking system in my family. But yes, I'm very lucky.
Was it Bennett that came up with the concept of hypoxis? I'm
not
trying
sure.
to remember.
I'm going to be ashamed and say I'm not very good at tracking all that stuff. I get very confused about which one did what.
Okay, because at the end of in the analysis section at the end of Man and Time, Priestley has a whole section on the theoretical areas of time perception, and he mentions people like Rodney Collin and Bennett, and there is another individual who has slipped my mind that he also mentioned, all of whom were involved in various societies. Now, you're mentioning there about the fact that the house on the Isle of Wight was haunted is really intriguing, and I'm sure that, as you probably know, I'm very friendly with J.B. Priestley's great-great-grandson, Luke, and Luke will be absolutely fascinated by that, as I am indeed, because, you know, there's a lot of people turning around and saying that, you know, Priestley wasn't necessarily interested in this phenomenon at all, and I've argued all the way along that, of course, he was. It fascinated him all his life. And there is evidence of it from your family experiences.
Oh yeah, no, they were definitely. And my grandmother was. I remember my grandmother saying that she was. They were there, and on one occasion she was sitting opposite Priestley's wife. I can't remember which wife it was at that point. He was sitting opposite his wife, and she said, "Oh, do move yourself. Someone's just trying to get past."
Really? How fascinating.
But,
so going back now, because I just thought it was a very important aside, because there was a fantastic link there. But in terms of your own extraordinary experiences that you think, and I totally agree with you, are facilitated by the particular neurological conditions that take place during a TLE absence or a TLE aura state or whatever. Have you had any other experiences similar to the one you described that are precognitive in some way, or unusual or entity related?
in terms of entities, not really, not like that. That was so extraordinary as to be, and I'm actually very glad of that. would not want that. I mean, I think I would not want anything. I mean, I joke, like a lot of people, I joke about the pixies and about things moving, and I have had that when I'm stressed. I would say that things break a little bit more usual, and within that kind of, and I did on one occasion when I was writing an article on a demon, I did have things get a little bit more unpleasant around the house, and I stopped writing the article and things felt a lot better. And that's only happened to me once when writing something, and I was very relieved when I stopped doing that. And that's only happened to me once, and I would never be, and I would have previously said, nope, I don't believe that ever happens. But it was like after a thunderstorm, whether that was because I was exceptionally stressed or something, but I was very stressed at the time. But that was horrific. That was horrible. I was writing an article on a particularly unpleasant demonic manifestation, and it was an incredibly unpleasant period in our house. Finding things messy, and on one occasion finding a smear on our kitchen window that we couldn't have reached with our hands. It was horrible. And again, I would never have, that's the only time I've ever been freaked out by anything I was writing. I have no idea where that came from, and that's the only time I've ever been freaked, and I've never been freaked out by anything I was writing ever. And I've written some pretty horrible, nasty stuff, scary stuff. Some of it designed to scare people, because that's the job sometimes, is write something that spooks people out. But no, not really. And I think I kind of, as I grew up in the thing that you were expecting, it sounds so normal, I kind of grew up expecting things to, precognitive stuff to happen. That's strange. I remember my mum told me when she was at university, she had this great one, which was that she'd been, she went and she came down to breakfast one morning. She was in her university, she was staying to revise for an extra weekend, or she came early for term or something at university, and she came down for breakfast and she goes, God, did you hear that party downstairs? It was horrible, wasn't it? The noise, it was horrific. And her friends go, no, there was no party downstairs last night. It's completely quiet. And she went, oh, okay, well, I must have dreamt it then. She was horrible though. I couldn't sleep. Going, no, there's no party. Next week, of course, complete raging party under her room.
Wow.
She'd heard it a week early.
Wow, that is almost a kind of a future vision, almost like
that would be the sort of thing that would happen to my mum. My mum used to dream the paper the night before.
Really?
As a child.
But that's interesting, isn't it? That she had these experiences, although clearly, well, she's not been diagnosed with TLA in any shape or form.
No, I think she wouldn't be on that spectrum. She's synesthesiac though.
She's a synesthesiac.
Yeah.
Interesting. Really?
She's within the whole same sort of brain family.
Yes.
I think it's all so much more complicated of how the brain is constructed. The misputting together of the brain, as it were, and the way the brain bursts together. I think no, but she's very strongly synesthesiac, and I would think that would probably come under that heading.
Well, this is the billion-dollar question then, really, is what do you think is happening in these experiences? What do you think this tells us about the nature of reality?
I have no idea, and I'm not sure if I want to know. I'd love to know. It's awful, isn't it? I'd love to know, but on the other hand, do I want to know? Isn't that awful?
Yes, because you do sometimes wonder, don't you, that you think there are certain things that we should know and there are certain things we shouldn't know. And, some of the areas that you and I are both interested in take you into the kind of the liminal areas that really sometimes you feel, I'm at ease where I am with this, and you sometimes think, is this crazy? Or am I manifesting this in some way around me? Because as you said, it just does seem, of course, if we take quantum physics into account, the idea that in some way the act of observation can in some way manipulate the reality around us, this begs certain questions. Now, one of the areas that you have written extensively about, and I reread the article recently, and we were talking about it before we started, is this concept of otherkin. And it's a wonderful article, and I do strongly suggest anybody, if you get the opportunity, it's in Fortean Times 283, Emma's article, and it is wonderful. It's also beautifully illustrated. I think the illustration that in there is absolutely wonderful as well. I don't know who did that. But can you tell us a little bit about what otherkin are and what is going on here? I know it's an online thing, but can you tell us a little bit about it and where it's going now?
Well, at its simplest, it's people who believe that their souls are mythical creatures. There's a sort of parallel, which are people who think their souls are animals. But at its simplest, otherkin are people who believe their souls are mythical creatures. There's now a sort of another group who are the people who believe that their souls are fictional characters. That's really only happened in the last 5 years, and I don't know what that's all about really, but the mythical creatures are fascinating. So I started writing about them, way back now. It must almost be way back in like the early, about 2006 now, quite a long time ago. And as a phenomenon, it's grown so much now in people believing this. It was really Tumblr, the microblogging platform, is where it's really taken off, particularly among younger people. It's also where it sort of ties in with the consciousness identity side, is that it's associated now as a little bit with the dissociative identity, which used to be multiple personality, but also with the idea of positive multiples and having alternate personalities, but also having multiple alters, or just having multiple souls, and saying that you haven't just got one alternate soul within you. So you're not just an elf, but you're also got lots and lots of these personalities. So it's not like it used to be, where it used to be, I've got the soul of an elf. It's also, I've got the soul of a character from Overwatch, or I've got a character from whatever, which I think is within them, there's a conflict from the original otherkin community, who I will say are a lovely community, who are wonderful, and there are some lovely people. And within that, it's fascinating. And then within that, then, as I said, the dissociative identity community and the positive healthy alters community, who go down the idea that what used to be the idea of integration, the idea that if you had a multiple personality, you had to be integrated into one healthy person, and that if you were the idea was if you had a multiple personality or dissociative personality, at some point your personality had fractured due to trauma. And some of these people believed that maybe they'd actually be multiples originally, and that they hadn't fractured ever. They were always multiples, and that maybe the abuse had just happened to a multiple. And other ideas that maybe they were walk-ins, that souls had added to them. This idea that there was a plurality, and that a healthy plurality was one word that comes up again and again. And then these ideas then layer upon ideas of other kin and ideas of multiple things. Then again, in the last few years, another idea came on the scene, which again borrows again from all these other ideas, and all these things pile on top of each other. And again, they link up again with consciousness and your ideas as well. The idea of tulpas. We had the old idea of tulpas, which Alexandra David Neal with her studies in Tibet made famous. But a few years ago, there was a tulpa community developed. And the tulpa community believed that they could create a best friend for life in their brain, and they could deliberately create a multiple personality. And rather unfortunately, this came out of the adult My Little Pony community originally, partly. So it's always kind of been associated with that a little bit, because I think for some reason it was some bronies originally who did this. But the tulpa community, again, is fascinating, and I don't know how much of it is real, whether they've actually done it or not, whether it's healthy to do it, whether they've actually managed to split their person, if they've actually managed to split consciousness, whether if you put them in an EEG, would it actually be like people with dissociative identity? But again, it comes back again to my interests. If it's an anomalous, if they managed to create it, what does that tell us about dissociative identity? Why would you want to create a friend for life in your brain? I totally cannot understand the appeal for that. I find having people in my head, in my personal space all the time annoying anyway. Why would you want it in your head permanently? It's fascinating. And you get debates as to what happens. Is it wrong to kill your tulpa if you get sick of them? I don't know. They're not real, but that's just me. But it's a fascinating area. But so hopefully I'll get a chance to write about that at some point. But you kind of feel intrusive. It kind of goes back to some of my unease I had when I studied anthropology. I'm nowhere near nosy enough to be an anthropologist. It's quite nosy to be an anthropologist. I'm not that nosy. So I kind of feel a bit guilty about that, but it's fascinating to know. But again, from the consciousness side is, can you do it? Are you doing it? Or are you just pretending? Is it role play? I don't know. Are they kidding themselves? It's a very elaborate fantasy, if they are.
It is, isn't it? And it's something, again, there's a link here to Priestley. You may not be aware of there's the link to Priestley. But Priestley he wrote, while he was living, funnily enough, at the house on the Isle of Wight, his daughter was having a relationship, and I think subsequently married, I think he was a North European, he may have been Dutch, I'm not quite sure. But Jack and this guy actually wrote a story called Total Tulpa. And curiously enough, the rights for it was bought by, of all people, Norman Wisdom. And it never really appeared anywhere, but it was a fascinating idea, because of course Priestley, way back in the late 1920s, early 1930s, wrote a story about a man who created a girlfriend from somebody on the silver screen, very much similar to what I think was a very famous film that Woody Allen did about somebody coming down off the screen.
Purple Rose of Cairo.
The Purple Rose of Cairo, of course, thank you.
One of my favourite films, Woody Allen being a creep.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful film. It is a wonderful film. But it is this idea, isn't it, of this creation of an entity. Now, again, as you say, the Alexander Neal work that she did, and of course the creation of, I think it was it Thomas or Edward or whatever, the group of people in Toronto that created this being that they decided to create, eventually.
Conjuring Philip.
Philip, that's it, thank you. And you do wonder, can we manifest in some way an egregore, I suppose is the technical term for it. And it seems to me this is what these individuals are trying to do. But as you say, that it has these elements of the dissociative personality syndrome, multiple personalities, and it just seems that we can slip into this kind of worldview. And as you said, and I think it's a very good point, if you could do some kind of EEG scan of somebody who's in an altered state, and they are manifesting another identity, whether the personality traits would be different. Whether you could apply, for instance, psychometric profiling to them, all these kind of things. There's some fascinating areas that we could move into there in terms of that. So we're moving now quickly on. So what are your plans for the future now? What are you going to be doing? What are the things that are shaking your tree now? The things you're going to be writing about? Because you're obviously interested in some fascinating areas.
Well, I've been on sick leave for a while now because I had to take a little bit of a break and have babies and be sick and recover from being quite ill recently. But I'm hoping, as I get better, do a lot more writing. And I've got a couple of books planned. A couple are a bit pulpy, I'll be honest, because I think sometimes people need a bit of pulp. I don't think there's enough really, really pulp. I think back in the 80s, there was some really, really, really good pulpy mystery books. I think we need those back. I think maybe a few of those, and I think a few more serious ones. I'm hoping. I think get me out together and write some serious ones. But I think maybe a bit of pulpy stuff. But so definitely, I'd like something along the lines of looking at identity, which way I'll go on that stuff with the back to the other kin side of things, and I would like to look at the consciousness TLE side and how that really has shaped things, because I do think it's, if you look at it over historically, and even got Alexander the Great had epilepsy, if we're going to say, that was probably one of the most influential men in history. He's mentioned in the Quran under a different name, so he's one of the most powerful men in history. So I think looking at how these things are shaped. Before I got very sick last 2 years ago, though, I nearly finished a book on Christmas horrors, though. So I think that's probably the first one that's got to get finished. It's very, very nearly finished. So it's got to get finished, hopefully in time for Christmas. But yes, and hopefully get these things. But I think, like I said, look, probably work on something to do with identity and consciousness. But I guess I think as well, try and bring things a little bit more. I think one of the things I'd like to do as well is I think people have got to, there is a stigma to the interest in this. I think it's become very much, the skeptic side has become a little bit too, it's become quite nasty for a start. And it's become quite, it's very hard to say, well, you can be interested in this stuff without being gullible and without meaning that you're interested in everything. It's because I'm interested in stuff and I write about it. It doesn't mean that I sit there going, oh my goodness, I believe in absolutely everything and I like everything I see and I believe it all. It's okay. It's okay. And it's okay to have fun with it, and it's okay to believe some stuff and not believe in other stuff, and to find it inherently interesting. Because personally, once somebody has an experience, I think that's interesting, whether or not I think it's, and I'm not sure there is any such thing as true.
None of it is truth. Honestly, it's all theory. I mean, we have to be honest with that. I'm sorry, I couldn't hold my tongue anymore. I'm listening to both of you guys, and I'm like biting my tongue until it bleeds. But you have to be.
You're very welcome. Join in.
Exactly.
You've already gone down the rabbit hole, Emma. You can't. You've opened the door, sweetie. You can't turn back now.
There's no such thing as true. There's no such thing as true. There's no such thing as true.
We really don't know what any of this is. It's all theory. I mean, none of us are going to know. It's all fascinating and interesting, but none of us, honestly, if we're truly honest with ourselves, we're never going to know what the truth is. That's what kills us all. That's what kills everyone.
Very much so. I mean, it's something that truth, I mean, you could get into some very, very philosophical arguments and discussions exactly what we mean when we talk about truth. Truth is something that is true for you, something that is based from your empirical, literally from experiences. And, you know, effectively, I know many people that have had extraordinary experiences, and they have been affected by them. And I think, Emma, your point is a very, very powerful one, that you don't have to be a sky pilot to be interested in these subjects. You don't have to be somebody strange. It doesn't mean you're effectively believing everything, but you're being open-minded as long as your brains don't fall out. And there is a very strong, vehemently nasty skeptical community out there, and it's moving towards these. And these people irritate the hell out of me. They really do. You know, and it's about time they had a comeuppance. You know, for instance, you know, the research I'm doing for my new book at the moment, you know, for instance, they don't even know. They talk about the things they know about quantum physics and the things that they clearly don't know, and the games they play pretending they understand. I mean, nobody understands how magnetism works. Nobody understands why electrical attraction works. Nobody understands why something's positive or negative. They know the processes and what happens, but they don't know what causes it. You know, so there's this huge hubris going on here. And I think what I think would be powerfully important is a book written by somebody like yourself from the TLE viewpoint of the experiences you've had, of the worldview. And I know that particularly people within the TLE community are crying out for something like this. I know people like O.C. Temkin wrote a wonderful book about it many, many years ago, and there's been various other very, very good books written about TLE, but not necessarily from the experiencer point of view. And I think that's profoundly important. And I don't know if you've come across the work, somebody who's been on this show in the past is a guy called Myron Dial, who's an artist based in the USA. And I've interviewed Myron a couple of times, you know, and his experiences, which I discuss in great detail in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, are just absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. You know, and clearly these are experiences that have changed his life powerfully. He's manifested his own lifelong friend, which of course I would argue is the daemon in himself, which he calls Charon. And I regularly get messages from people around the world who have experienced TLE, who have this hidden partner, have this entity that's with them throughout their lives. You know, this is something that it's profoundly important and profoundly significant. And of profound importance. So I really look forward to your future work. I really do. That could be very interesting. Right, Emma, is there anything else you want to say? Is there anything in terms of if people want to contact you or want to check out your work or anything? I know that you have a website. I don't know how active that is or your work.
Not very active at the moment, but it's there. It's www.emmamcneil.co.uk. And it's there. I probably have some dead links on it because various organisations have finished. It's there, and if you're in Northern Ireland and you have a rare disease, there's www.nrdp.org.uk. So we're there to support people with rare diseases. So it's a very niche group if anyone here needs help. But so thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. Your personality and your humour and your fascination on life actually sort of beams out of you. It's incredible. It's incredible. You're great fun to interview. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for those wonderful articles in the Fortean Times. Thoroughly enjoyed them, and thanks very much for being on the show. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And as always, thanks to Dia over in 100-degree Fahrenheit Denver, who's over there slowly cooking away. And everything else as well. So thanks everybody, and we'll be back with you again next month for another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.